Medium rare. Medium rare is the universal steakhouse standard. Order a steak with no stated preference, and most kitchens will send it out this way. It sits at an internal temperature of 130 to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. It has a warm, distinct pink center wrapped in a deeply browned, caramelized, and seared crust. The reason comes down to the proteins. At this exact range, the muscle fibers in the beef relax to their maximum tenderness without contracting enough to push out the natural juices. Go even slightly hotter, and that balance starts to tip. Many diners avoid it because they believe the red juices are blood. It's myoglobin, a water-soluble protein that carries oxygen through muscle tissue. It's also what gives raw and lightly cooked beef its red color in the first place. And at this temperature range, the myoglobin is only just beginning to change. That's why the center looks pink instead of fully red or fully brown. Medium. Medium is pulled from the heat at 140 to 145 degrees Fahrenheit. This creates a firm overall texture and a very noticeably narrower band of pink in the center. For lean cuts, medium is usually where things start drying out. But for high-fat beef cuts, like a heavily marbled ribeye, it can actually be the better choice. That's because marbling is just fat running through the muscle. At medium rare, that intramuscular fat hasn't fully melted yet. Push it to medium, and the fat renders, spreads through the meat, and bastes it from the inside. It also distributes a rich, buttery flavor throughout the entire muscle structure during the cooking process, so a fattier cut at medium can taste juicier than the same cut at medium rare. Counterintuitive, sure, but it's just chemistry. This is also why some kitchens quietly cook a heavily marbled steak slightly past what you ordered. They're compensating for the fat content. Rare. Rare requires an internal temperature of 120 to 125 degrees Fahrenheit. The center is cool, bright red, and has an incredibly soft and delicate bite. Wealthy landowners preferred the unaltered flavors of fresh game and livestock because to them the goal was to taste the beef itself, not the cooking process. Achieving a perfect rare steak is harder than it sounds. It relies on a sharp, aggressive temperature gradient. You need an extremely hot surface, something north of 280 degrees Fahrenheit, to trigger the Maillard reaction and form a crust fast. At the same time, the dense muscle tissue slows heat transfer to the center of the meat. There's one misconception. Rare steak doesn't mean undercooked or raw. It's actually a highly controlled result. The surface heat builds the crust, while the interior stays close to its natural state. Medium well moves into mostly cooked territory. The internal temperature sits at 150 to 155 degrees Fahrenheit. The steak has a stiff overall texture and a faint, pale hint of pink in the absolute center, surrounded by gray-brown meat. This doneness level took off in the mid-20th century alongside chain restaurants. Diners wanted reassurance that their food was fully cooked without going all the way to well done. The cost of this doneness level is that at this temperature, the structural proteins contract significantly, pushing out most of the internal moisture. Some kitchens deal with this by using a slightly thinner cut for medium well orders. This way, the heat reaches the center faster so the exterior doesn't overcook while waiting for the inside to catch up. Well done. Well done is a completely cooked piece of meat. The internal temperature must exceed 160 degrees Fahrenheit. The interior is entirely gray-brown with zero trace of pink and a dense, stiff texture. Go back far enough in food history and well done wasn't a preference. It was a survival necessity. Before refrigeration, cooking meat all the way through was the only safe option. At 160 degrees, the proteins fully collapse and whatever moisture remains evaporates rapidly. Because high heat erases most of the flavor differences between a prime cut and a budget one, some kitchens quietly send their least marbled steaks to well-done orders. None of the marbling, the aging, or even the subtle flavor will survive the intense temperature anyway. So why waste a prime cut on it? While the well-done technique is heavily criticized when applied to whole muscle steaks, this exact level of doneness is a strict legal safety requirement for ground beef. Blue rare. Blue rare sits at the extreme end of the spectrum. The exterior is blasted at maximum heat for less than 60 seconds, while the inside stays completely raw, purple red, and cold. The internal temperature never exceeds 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The most common version of this style traces back to steelworkers in Pittsburgh during the city's industrial boom. Legend states that workers would bring raw steaks to the mills and slap them directly onto the glowing hot sides of blast furnaces to cook them instantly. A few seconds on each side was enough to char the outside completely, while the center stayed essentially raw. The name bleu comes from French culinary tradition. The term bleu refers to the faint bluish-purple tint that fresh, unoxygenated beef displays before it's exposed to air. Steak tartare. Steak tartare uses zero heat. It's high-quality raw beef, finely minced, mixed with capers, onions, mustard, and often topped with a raw egg yolk. The dish became a staple in French bistros in the early 20th century. A popular myth linked it to Mongol horsemen who tenderized meat under their saddles. That story is almost certainly a myth. Food historians trace the dish to French cooking around the time of meat shortages, when other types of meat were sometimes substituted for beef. Without heat, there's no Maillard reaction and no fat rendering. The preparation relies entirely on mechanical tenderization through precise knife work. Fine mincing breaks down the muscle fibers by hand, which is what makes the texture work. There's also a chemical trick happening on the plate. Ingredients like mustard and capers are acidic, and acid slightly alters the surface proteins of raw meat. This creates a chemical process that mimics light cooking without any heat applied. Beef carpaccio. Carpaccio is raw beef muscle, sliced paper-thin, arranged across a plate, and lightly dressed with olive oil, lemon juice, and shaved cheese. This one has an exact origin story. It was created in 1950 at Harry's Bar in Venice by Giuseppe Cipriani, specifically for a countess whose doctor had ordered her to avoid cooked meat entirely. Cipriani needed something that satisfied that restriction. He sliced raw beef as thin as he could get it and dressed it simply. To achieve the necessary translucent thickness, chefs freeze the beef loin until it's semi-rigid, then use a mechanical slicer to shave it into near-transparent sheets. Cipriani named the dish after the Renaissance painter Vittore Carpaccio because the deep red color of the raw beef matched the rich reds in the painter's work. Because the slices are so thin, the lemon juice in the dressing can actually start to whiten the meat if the plate sits too long. Overcooked. Past 175 degrees Fahrenheit, steak crosses into territory nobody orders on purpose. The exterior turns fully black, the texture turns dry and brittle, and the flavor turns bitter. This is almost always the result of kitchen negligence or uncontrolled grill flare-ups. At well done, the meat is dry. At this stage, the proteins aren't just tightening, they're undergoing thermal decomposition. The molecular bonds break down entirely, leaving behind carbon. Every trace of moisture, fat, and natural flavor gets replaced by acrid compounds. There is one strange exception, though. Some chefs deliberately char small pieces of beef to scrape into sauces. Used in tiny quantities, that bitter, smoky edge can actually round out a sauce. But as a steak on its own, this stage is simply a mistake.